Still, of course, some Egyptians enjoyed or preferred working for the government, but majority of Egyptians had economic responsibility. I think one of the major problems which we learned in the 60s was too much reliance on the state in terms of economy, of education, healthcare. Everything we look to the state or turn to the state looking for support and subsidies even. And I think this accumulated decade after decade until we started I think in 2000s, we started seeing some signs of growing the economy in a kind of a free market atmosphere. But unfortunately, at that point, Mubarak was too old, and we had the NDP has become so corrupt that business tycoons also infiltrated the political process, and the country, the state went into some expansionist scheme, which meant that there was a lot of public borrowing. The public debt was jumping every year, maybe 100 billion Egyptian pounds, almost 100 or 200 Egyptian pounds every year for the last 10 years. So we arrived 2011 in a shape of huge public debt by 2011. So add to that, from 2011, 2012, and 2013, we had loss of security. A lot of investors, they pulled back. As you said, tourism, of course, whenever security collapses, tourism goes back. So we had a severe deficit in foreign currency. We had a severe deficit also in our general budget. And now we're standing at almost 2 trillion Egyptian pound national debt. And this is a very, very difficult situation. So I think what we heard from the candidates, some bold initiatives, and I think the thing which really pleases me, that I sense the urgency in both candidates, that they realize that we are really, this is not business as usual. Egypt is facing an existential threat. And not just because of the economy, because of so many things that have been ignored and neglected for the past 50 years, including things like we have tripled between 1950s, when Egypt was only about 24, 25 million people. Now we are talking about 85 million people. So we more than tripled in size of population. But the piece of land we're living on is almost the same. It has, maybe increased by 20 or 30%, but Egypt has become so crowded, which means that it is crowded in the sense of people fighting for little opportunities and splitting pieces of land. So the house which was housing one family now is split and housing two, and then split as housing four. And the piece of land which was 5 or 10 faddans enough for one family, it's become split, and everything has disintegrated in productivity as a result of all of this neglect. So now we're facing the moment of truth. Is Egypt going to survive or not? And I think it's a very important point of history, and I hope that the Egyptian people will realize that whoever wins, we would have to work really hard to get out of this steep hole.
Right, that's very true, but at least the foundation looks very optimistic. The choices are promising.
The choices, again, I think what I heard from the candidates, let me give, for example, Field Marshal Sisi. He spoke for 2 days. We heard him for 2 days. He had, what really comforted me most was his sense of urgency. He realized that there is a huge problem. This is in itself, realization of the problem is in itself a first step, because whenever you say, everything is fine, but really,
the same tone for any presidential campaign.
And I think that this was in itself was an important thing, but I need to say that Egyptians will have to work hard. There's no candidate would have
a magic wand.
A magic wand, exactly.
Right.
What has to happen is Egyptians have to work hard with whoever wins the coming elections. And in fact, both candidates, whoever wins, they have to work together, because we have to get out of this hole.
Right, we're going to touch on each vision of every candidate later on in the program, but let's have a closer look over the supporters of both candidates, Sabahi and Sisi. We could find that the latter, Sisi, is not depending on a particular political faction or a group. He's supporting basis the Egyptian people, those people who went in mass numbers, more than 45 million on June 30th to the streets to bring down the Muslim Brotherhood rule. And if you look at Sabahi's supporters, we could see he is mainly depending on socialist leftists and extreme liberals and some people who were against removing the Muslim Brotherhood rule in Egypt. Would that classification of the supporters of each candidate explain him as president whenever he steps into office later on?
Again, it goes back to the political culture of the Egyptians. Marshal Sisi, with his assistance and his brave decision or bold decision to take the Egyptian people's side, has made him a hero. And again, I personally would have preferred him to remain the defense minister. However, the Egyptians, regarding him as a hero or a national hero, they asked him to step into the presidential race. So what Sisi really depends on is the national support of people that are actually grateful for the step that Sisi, or the bold decision that Sisi has taken. However, on the other side, we've got people that since January 25th are anti-army rule. We've got people that are not really happy with the removal of the Muslim Brotherhood, as you said. We've got people that thinking totally objectively and thinking that Sisi is probably not the right person. So we've got two parties that, one party that supports Sisi and the other party that supports Hamdin Sabahi. But again, Sisi, yes, doesn't have a political backup, but he depends mainly on the national support. And in the political sphere, this is a lot stronger than depending on a political party, because it's really governed by masses of millions of Egyptians. And you could also see that from the endorsements that you obtained from the Ministry of Justice. In order to nominate himself, he obtained almost 190,000 compared to 31,000 letters, really. So again, it reflects the national support. So in terms of who's going to be really able to deliver, this is really something that we need to look at the program and the vision of each one. And I personally prefer in the mega plan that needs to be implemented is, number one, looking at the reform of institutions and restructuring the government, and number two is the use of land, as Mr. Nawara said earlier. What I liked about the Sisi particularly, and this is not really a promotion, but what he really looked at is the redesign of the Egyptian governorates or the provinces, and I tackled that in the last 3 years in the mega project of the second crossing. He's looking at redesigning the provinces of Egypt to get out of the 6% that we already living in. We've got about 82 million people, 72 million people living in the north and along the Nile River. So we need to get out of there. And then from there, looking at a mega 10-year plan for each province or each piece of land that needs to be contributing towards the economy, looking at the contribution of each area to the national economy, looking at the implementation of close to 18 mega projects in Egypt. So in terms of the two groups, again, I think in terms of the national support, Egyptians are supporting Sisi, being grateful for what he's done, but again, they need to look at the program. Is he really going to be able, based on his vision, being able to deliver? And from there, also looking at Hamdin Sabahi, probably 160 pages program, is he going to be able to deliver? And here again, I go back to the political culture. We need to start reading about these people, looking at the vision, whatever is realistic and feasible to be implemented, so we don't fall into the mistake that we all almost committed in 2012.
Right, Mr. Nawara, if we could start off by the presidential runner, Mr. Sisi. He looked to be very certain. You earlier talked about his media interviews, earlier 3 media interviews. He looked very honest and defying, and he was full of confidence. The first moment we heard him talking about his vision, or may I call it the program, because there is no clear program yet, we could easily notice that this is a man who really doesn't seem to worry much about about what people think about him or what people is expecting from him, whether he is supposed to please this person, this faction or no, whether they're going to like his vision or no, because he feels that he is a man who was mandated by most of the Egyptians, that he has a mission to fulfill. He was not in full desire to be stepping in for running for presidency and all that. And when he expresses his very defying vision, very clear, very certain, he does not expect approval from people, and he made it very clear. He said, well, if you don't like it, I'm sorry, but this could be the only way out through the